Chevrolet once sold a Corvette that most people never should have been allowed to buy. It was loud, hostile, barely street-friendly, and built around an engine that belonged on a racetrack, not a public road. Chevrolet even lied about how powerful it was, on purpose, just to keep it out of the wrong hands. If you're into the kind of car stories that feel more like secrets than advertisements, this is one you'll want to stay for. The 1967 L-88 Corvette wasn't built to impress casual buyers. In fact, it was priced so high that only the most serious performance addicts even considered it. So why does this Corvette still matter today? Why do collectors fight over it? And why has one sold for millions of dollars while other Corvettes from the same era struggle to reach a fraction of that value? To answer that, we have to rewind to the Corvette that made something like the L88 possible in the first place, and why Chevrolet was even willing to build a car this extreme. The C2 Corvette, before the madness. To understand the L88, we first have to rewind a few years back to a moment when the Corvette was already carving out a reputation as America's true sports car. By 1963, Chevrolet introduced the second generation of Corvettes, known today as the C2. This was the era of the iconic Stingray design. Low, wide, muscular, and purposeful. Unlike earlier Corvettes that were almost cruiser-like in character, the C2 was designed from the ground up for performance. Independent rear suspension, a sleeker body, and a chassis that could actually handle more power made it a real driver's car, not just a fast, straight-line cruiser. Throughout the mid-60s, engine options expanded rapidly. Early C2s could be ordered with Chevy's potent small block V8, but soon the big block 427 cubic inch engine took center stage. These big blocks were no joke. They pushed horsepower into the 400 plus range, putting them in muscle car territory and beyond. Racers and tuners alike started circling these Corvettes like sharks smelling blood in the water. Even before the L88 came along, a properly built 427 Corvette could steamroll through the quarter mile in the low 12-second range, blistering for the era. But for Chevrolet engineers like Zora Arkus Duntov, that still wasn't enough. They wanted more, a version of the Corvette that didn't just flirt with race car performance, but fully embraced it. That obsession with speed set the stage for one of the most extreme options ever offered on a production Corvette, the L88 package. Why the L88 even existed? You might be wondering, why would Chevrolet bother building something this insane in the first place? After all, even in the 1960s, most Corvette buyers wanted a fast car they could live with on the street, not a race-bred monster that needed special fuel and barely walked at idle. The short answer? Racing rules and automotive ambition. Back then, many racing organizations, particularly the sports, Car Club of America, SCCA, and even some drag racing classes, required that cars use street-legal production engines if they were going to compete. That meant if Chevrolet wanted to showcase the Corvette's capabilities on the track using its own engines, it had to sell those engines to the public. But here's the catch. Most everyday buyers didn't want a prop shaft screaming in their driveway, let alone an engine that needed race fuel and hated low-speed cruising. So, Chevy did something pretty clever. They created the L88 not as a mass-market option, but as a homologation package, essentially a way to get a pure race engine, street legal, just enough to satisfy the rule makers. It was available to the public, but Chevrolet didn't shy away from making it extreme. In fact, they leaned into it. To discourage casual buyers, Chevrolet intentionally underrated the engine's power on paper and omitted many comfort features you'd expect from a Corvette. More on that soon. The result? The L88 became the secret weapon of racers and performance purists. It wasn't made to sell in large numbers, but it was made to dominate on the track. And boy, did it. The L88 engine, the big block Chevy, that lied on paper. Alright, here's where the myth starts to feel real, and honestly, a little bit crazy. On paper, Chevrolet rated the 1967 L-88's engine at 430 horsepower and 460 lb-ft of torque, figures that barely outpaced the less extreme 427 engines in other Corvettes that same year. But the thing is, those numbers weren't a mistake. They were intentional, a smokescreen. Back in the late 1960s, horsepower wars were raging, but regulators and insurance companies were starting to eye insanely powerful engines with suspicion. So, Chevrolet played it cool. They published a conservative figure of 430 gross horsepower at 5,200 RPM, which in itself was measured without many real-world parts installed. In reality, this engine was a full-on racing monster. The L88 package used a 427 cubic inch big block, but that's where the similarity with other 427s ended. It had a 12.5.1 compression ratio, forged pistons and rods, hardened push rods, aluminum cross-flow cylinder heads, a radical solid lifter camshaft, and the biggest Holley carburetor Chevy ever put on a production V8 at the time, an 850 CFM 4-barrel. Dyno tests and race results from period and modern sources tell the real story. In a stock configuration running the right fuel and an open exhaust, this engine routinely produced well over what it was rated, more like 500 to 560 plus horsepower, near its 6,200 6,500 RPM peak. That put it in the same performance class as purpose-built race cars of the era, not typical street engines. Chevrolet didn't just strap a big motor into a Corvette and call it a day. They tailored this power plant for race readiness from the start. There was no tolerance for street car soft living, just pure, unfiltered performance. When you asked for the L88, you were essentially ordering a factory-built race engine that happened to be legal to register on the street, if you had the nerve to drive it like one. And trust me, most people didn't. That's why, despite what the sticker said, the L88 wasn't viewed as just another powerful Corvette back in the day. It was something much rarer and much more terrifying. Quick pause for a second. If you're enjoying deep dives like this into the wildest cars ever built, take a moment to like the video. It really helps get these stories in front of other enthusiasts. And if you've ever seen an L88 in person, or even just a big block C2, drop a comment below. We would love to hear where. A Corvette that actively hated the street. Now, picture this. You order your brand new Corvette with the most badass engine available. But when it arrives, there's no heater, no radio, no air conditioning, nothing to make it comfortable, no stereo to listen to, no warmth in winter, not even a fan shroud to help cool the engine at idle. Why? Because every pound of weight and every bit of plumbing not essential to going fast was stripped away. Even redundant emission hardware was gone. It was as if the engineers wanted to say, if you're not racing this, you're wasting it. And then there's the transmission. The L88 Corvette came standard with the M22 Rock Crusher 4-speed manual, a gearbox known for its distinctive loud whine, thanks to its straight-cut gears. It was strong enough to handle all that torque and power, but it did not purr. It growled, loudly. Underneath, performance hardware was equally serious. Heavy-duty brakes, a posi-traction limited slip rear end, and a firmer suspension were all part of the package. Not as options you could choose, but as essentials you had to have. In other words, the L88 was almost antagonistic toward cruising. This was a machine built for attacking pavement. Whether that pavement was a quarter mile, strip, or a road course, it was an unapologetic focus on speed, and that's exactly what made it so intoxicating to the people who did buy one. Built to go fast, not to sell. Well, here's the part that really surprises people. The L88 Corvette was expensive, and that was intentional too. While a base 1967 Corvette cost just a few $1,000s, the L88 package alone, remember, with its race-ready engine and all the required hardware, added nearly $948 on top of the price. In total, those L88 Corvettes were pushing prices that only serious racers or wealthy enthusiasts were willing to pay. But that's not all. Because the L88 package was so focused on competition performance, many mainstream buyers simply walked away. Why pay more for a car that was harder to live with on the street, required special fuel, and didn't even have the comfort options that came standard on cheaper Corvettes? The result: only 20 L88 Corvettes were built in 1967, a minuscule number in an era when Corvette production overall was in the tens of thousands. To put that in perspective, General Motors built over 22,900 Corvettes in 1967 across all engine options, yet just 20 of them wore the L88 badge that year. That's about 0.09% of total production, basically 1 in every 1,000 Corvettes. So, in the showroom, the L88 probably looked like a tough sell. It wasn't the car most buyers envisioned themselves taking on weekend cruises, but for those who did understand its purpose, it was the ultimate performance tool, a legitimate race engine in a street-legal shell. And while that goal dramatically limited how many were sold, it also planted the seeds for the L88's future iconic status. Today, experts estimate that roughly half or fewer of those original 1967 L88s are known to still exist. That's why collectors call it the Holy Grail, and once they began to understand what the L88 really was, values skyrocketed. The same traits that scared buyers away in 1967, the brutal engine, the lack of comforts, the uncompromising nature, became exactly what made the car special. It wasn't pretending to be anything else. It was honest to its core. Today, 1967 L88 Corvettes have sold for well over $2 million at auction, placing them among the most valuable American production cars ever. Later C3 L88 Corvettes, which were built in larger numbers and raced more extensively, still command serious money, often landing in the hundreds of thousands. But the 67 cars live in a different universe entirely. Outro, the 1967 L88 Corvette isn't legendary because it was perfect. It's legendary because it was unreasonable. It was too loud, too hot, too expensive, and too extreme for most people. And Chevrolet built it anyway. That's what makes it special. It wasn't designed to chase sales numbers or please the masses. It existed to push boundaries, to dominate tracks, and to prove what the Corvette could be when nothing else mattered but speed. And today, as modern cars grow quieter and more digital, the L88 stands as a reminder of a wilder era when power came without apologies and driving demanded commitment. If you ever see a real 1967 L88 in person, remember this: you're not just looking at a rare car. You're looking at a moment in history that will never be repeated. And that is what makes it truly unforgettable. And if you enjoy stories about cars that pushed limits and ignored common sense, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more like this still waiting to be told.